Okay, so my computer told me that the recording has started. So welcome everyone. Thanks for coming to the CX seminar. So today we have Professor Mette Hjort coming here to give us a talk. So Professor Mette Hjort is Professor of Film and Screen Studies at the University of Lincoln, and until recently Chair Professor of the Humanities and Dean of Arts at the Hong Kong Baptist University. In recognition of her contributions to the field of small nations and the film, Mette was awarded the honorary doctorate in transnational cinema studies by the University Aalborg in Denmark in 2017. And she has served on the board of Danish Film Institute and currently serves on the board of MACE, which represents, I think, Media Archive of Central England, based in Lincoln. Her most recent publication is a co-edited volume, Companion to Motion Pictures and Public Value, published by Wiley Blackwell last year, 2022. Her recent research focuses on motion pictures in the context of care, health, and well-being. And today's talk will be on UNESCO's Convention for the Protection and Promotion of the Diversity of Cultural Expression, international obligations and local priorities. I know last week was the World Day for Cultural Diversity. I think that we are slightly 1 week behind for this lecture, but it's never too late to hear about how to preserve cultural differences and diversities. So the floor is yours, Matt.
Thank you so much, Hongwei, for the kind invitation. I'm really, really happy to be able to speak to you. And thank you to those of you who are joining the session. Thank you for making time to hear me talk about this. I'm going to read my paper and I'm going to ask Hongwei to shift the slides for me. So every now and again, you'll hear me ask him to do that. The 2005 UNESCO Convention for the Protection and Promotion of the Diversity of Cultural Expressions is an international agreement originally ratified by 148 signatory states and the European Union. Focusing on the cultural sphere, the Convention is an instance of international policy formation aimed at achieving global progress towards specific goals through strategic efforts, including further policy initiatives. Next. As a policy phenomenon, the Convention is characterized by distinct levels. More specifically, UNESCO provides a supranational level of general policy formation and coordinated information gathering, while signatories at the national level are expected to pursue the goals of the Convention in their given nation-state context. Given that civil society organizations, CSOs, in signatory countries are seen as driving progress towards the Convention's goals, the Convention encompasses a further subnational level, one where cultural groups and organizations are expected to develop strategic, policy-style initiatives in keeping with UNESCO's globally oriented commitment to diversity. The combination of levels, ranging from the supranational through the national to the subnational, raises questions of both practical and theoretical consequence. Practically, for example, the fate of the Convention, whether its goals are furthered or thwarted, is tied to changes of government and thus the dynamics of national priorities. Theoretically, the Convention highlights features of the unique ontology of global policy formations that depend on robust engagement at various levels. The vitality of the Convention waxes and wanes depending on what does or does not exist at the constitutive national or subnational levels, starting most basically with knowledge of the Convention and a commitment to its articles in the CSO sector, so the civil society organization sector. Next, please. The aim in this paper is to evoke some of the challenges of implementing multi-level policy initiatives, and to do this through the dual lens of one of the UNESCO Convention signatories, Denmark, and its film-related CSOs, public sector organizations, henceforth PSOs. The Danish Film Institute, DFI, is especially important in this regard, given that its mission is entirely devoted to film. The Danish Centre for Culture and Development, DCCD in English, CKU in Danish, is also relevant, for film had a central place in many of this now defunct organization's programs in the so-called developing world, to use the language of the convention. The DCCD, an independent institution under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs from 1998 to 2016, was essentially responsible for the cultural dimension of Denmark's aid to so-called developing countries, until it was dissolved in 2016 by Lars Løkke Rasmussen's Conservative Liberal government. Following a brief overview of the Convention's goals and the rights and duties of its signatories in the first part of the paper, I examine the extent to which Denmark can be said to be implementing the Convention in a considered and strategic manner in the broad area of film. Next, please. Drawing on interviews with Anders Kronborg, the former chairman of the board of the Danish Film Institute, Palle Dam Legaard, the head of the management secretariat at the Danish Film Institute, and Ole Reithoff, a Danish member of the EU UNESCO expert facility on the governance of culture for the implementation of the 2005 Convention, I consider the following questions. To what extent does the Convention motivate policy formation at the level of film-related CSOs, PSOs in Denmark? How visible is the Convention in the context of the activities, self-understandings, and strategic talk of film-related CSOs, PSOs in Denmark? How might the prospects for the Convention's vitality and success be improved in the Danish context? What do the striking shifts of emphasis in Denmark's quadrennial UNESCO reports signify? In the second part of the paper, the focus is on 3 developments related to Denmark's quadrennial reports to the 2005 Convention. Analysis of these areas of film-related activity shows the following. Next, please. Denmark's commitment to the Convention has been seriously affected by the demise of the DCCD. Convention-consistent changes have gone unreported, and Convention-consistent initiatives have emerged for reasons having little to do with UNESCO and its priorities. The following headings capture the developments in question. The demise of the Danish Centre for Culture and Development, from Film Lab Palestine to Film Lab Zanzibar, Denmark's waning involvement in the Middle East and Africa, the film industry's Charter of Diversity, the policy effects of a tone-deaf rejection letter. So we'll get to those sections towards the end of my talk. Let me turn to the UNESCO Convention. The next slide, please. UNESCO describes the Convention as a milestone in international cultural policy. Indeed, the Convention, which garnered support from 148 nation states at the time of its adoption, only the USA and Israel offered a negative vote. The Convention is, quote, the first legally binding international instrument on culture, and I'm citing Bury 2013. UNESCO defines the significance of the Convention in terms of contributions to 3 fundamental areas. A, the complex value of culture. B, the cultural rights of sovereign states. And C, governance systems for culture. With regard to A, the Convention is said to codify the global community's recognition of contemporary cultural expressions as having both cultural and economic value. The Convention is construed as being at the heart of the creative economy, as, quote, shaping the design and implementation of policies and measures that support the creation, production, distribution of, and access to cultural goods and services, end of quote, and that's from UNESCO. With regard to B, having to do with cultural rights, the Convention is deemed to formalize, quote, the sovereign right of states to maintain, adopt, and implement policies to protect and promote the diversity of cultural expression, both nationally and internationally, end of quote. Indeed, the Convention builds on the French idea of a cultural exception, which is intimately associated with the 1993 GATT negotiations. Arguing that culture differs from commercial products and thus merits exclusion from the purview of trade agreements, France paved the way for the protection of national cultures through subsidies, quotas, and indirect trade barriers. Finally, with reference to C, governance, the Convention is seen by UNESCO as providing, quote, a new framework for informed, transparent, and participatory systems of governance for culture, end of quote, and it's the UNESCO text again. Next slide, please. An example of international policymaking, the Convention is not without its critics. Indeed, as a legally binding instrument, the Convention does not in fact encumber signatory states with obligations. Signatories are expected to report to the UNESCO Secretariat on a quadrennial basis, the aim being to share best practices and track progress toward the realization of the Convention's goals. Signatories are not, however, bound by targets, and there are no consequences associated with any regressive actions that might become apparent when recent reports are compared with earlier submissions. Nor, for that matter, are there any consequences associated with a failure to report. Next slide, please. There are, however, two clauses in the Convention that are seen as carrying particular weight. The first concerns the preferential treatment of developing countries. Quote, developed countries shall facilitate cultural exchanges with developing countries by granting, through the appropriate institutional and legal frameworks, preferential treatment to artists and other cultural professionals and practitioners, as well as cultural goods and services from developing countries, quoting UNESCO again. The second clause concerns the obligation of signatory states or their CSOs to cooperate, quote, in situations of serious threat to cultural expressions, end of quote. Cooperation in this instance is envisaged as typically involving, quote, assistance from developed to developing countries, end of quote, and that's Bury 2013. Whereas developing countries once were central to Denmark's reporting in the area of film, they are absent in the most recent report from 2020. The shift in question merits analysis and explanation and speaks to the ontology of an international policy formation that strengthens or diminishes in force as a function of changing priorities and political winds at the national or subnational levels. The next section, the UNESCO Convention in Denmark, deficits of dialogue and ownership. Denmark ratified the convention on the 18th of December 2006 and has filed quadrennial reports in 2012, 2016 and 2020. The next report is due in 2024. Next slide, please. The 2005 convention's so-called basic text speaks of a need to be vigilant about ensuring that the, quote, momentum towards full implementation on the ground is maintained, end of quote, and commits signatories to taking, quote, the necessary measures to increase the visibility and promotion of the convention at the national, regional, and international levels, end of quote. In this context, quote, the mobilization and cooperation of all stakeholders, namely the parties, civil society, including artists and other cultural professionals and practitioners, as well as the public and private sectors, end of quote, are seen as essential. Full implementation is thus envisaged as the desired outcome of an effective and regular dialogue between government and civil society about a cluster of goals related to cultural diversity. To support the dialogic process, the UNESCO Protocol for Quadrennial Reports requires the active involvement of CSOs/PSOs, the relevant reporting ministry being charged with soliciting input for its final submission through a so-called civil society organization form. Ideally, the inclusion of CSOs/PSOs in the reporting process promotes awareness of the convention and its goals beyond the highest level of government, strengthening the work of cultural diversity across the entire institutional ecology of cultural practice. In the Danish case, it is fair to say that the dialogic process has fallen short of the basic standards of a robust exchange. In the Danish context, the UNESCO portfolio normally resides with the Ministry of Children and Education. Reporting on activities related to the convention has, however, been the responsibility of the Ministry of Culture, a situation that has complicated matters of ownership and arguably weakened the required sense of responsibility. The will to engage in ongoing discussions of the convention's implications for cultural policy in Denmark has, it would appear, been lacking from the outset. Recalling Denmark's signing of the convention in 2006, Ole Reithoff, whom I mentioned earlier, speaks of an attempt by himself, Henning Kammerer, then CEO of the Danish Film Institute, and Olaf Gerlock Hansen, then head of the Danish Centre for Culture and Development, their efforts to prompt the Ministry of Culture to host a series of consultative fora. The response, claims Ole Reithoff, was lackluster and has not improved over the years. He says, there was no real dialogue. There have been a lot of ministers of culture over the years, and every time I've met with them, they've asked me to explain what the convention is actually about. They think that because we're part of it, we somehow have it all figured out. End of quote. The latter point finds support in the actual reports submitted by Denmark, where, quote, the implementation of the UNESCO 2005 convention, end of quote, is said to form a, quote, natural part of the Danish cultural policy, end of quote. Faith in the existence of a preordained harmony is evident in the Ministry of Culture's claim that, quote, during the last 50 years, the Danish cultural policy has been based on many of the same principles which are inherited in the convention, end of quote. The repeated suggestion is that Denmark was practicing cultural policy making in accordance with the convention even before the latter was summoned into existence by an international collectivity. The view appears to be that probing discussions regarding the implementation of the convention are in fact unnecessary in the Danish case, and that CSOs/PSOs can comfortably be left to pursue their core tasks without direct or even sidelong glances at UNESCO's texts and articles. The Ministry of Culture clearly implies that the outcomes of CSOs, PSOs' nationally mandated activities will harmonize quite naturally with the convention. In its quadrennial report from 2012, the Ministry of Culture admits to a certain deficit of dialogue, offering a perspective on its principal cause that deviates from Ole Reithoff's, inasmuch as the CSOs, PSOs, as opposed to the government, are seen as falling short. Yeah, we will go to, let's see, we need slide 10. It was just there a minute ago. There we go. Okay. Perfect. Nope. Yep. Next one, please. Yeah. One of the challenges has been to keep the public engaged in the implementation of the convention. In the first years after the Danish ratification of the convention, the Ministry of Culture arranged public hearings on a yearly basis, but the participation and involvement seemed to vanish. Artists' associations are engaged in the implementation of specific articles, but besides that, it is a very limited number of civil society associations that are actively engaged in the convention as such. End of quote. Interviews and brief exchanges with employees at the Danish Film Institute suggest that the ministry's perception of a lack of active engagement on the part of CSOs/PSOs is accurate at this point in time, although Reithoff, Kammer, and Gerlock Hansen's earlier efforts suggest that this was not always the case. Indeed, a DFI article points to Kammer's critical role in enabling UNESCO to secure support for the convention in the face of, quote, significant American opposition. And this is Charlotte Giese writing in 2007. At this point, however, knowledge of the convention and of the DFI's involvement in reporting in connection with Denmark's obligations as a signatory country is limited to a handful of individuals. The articles and texts of the convention are not a feature of the DFI's institutional discourse, nor do they figure on the agenda of the DFI's board, where strategic decisions are made. Next slide, please. Reasons for the convention's relative lack of visibility at the DFI are many, ranging from the way in which the quadrennial reports are compiled and their infrequent nature, through understandings of the DFI's core mission and role, to a conception of the convention as an unproblematic framework fact. With regard to the process of compilation, it is relevant to note that Paludan Legor at the DFI in the Secretariat, who is currently charged with preparing and submitting the DFI's report to the Ministry of Culture, is acutely aware of the reality that he is not filing a final report, but merely providing input to one. DFI initiatives, that is, may or may not be included in Denmark's periodic submission. It is easy to see that the possibility of editorial adjustments at the ministerial level and even entire omissions has a certain effect, transforming the task of reporting into a largely bureaucratic exercise. Bureaucratic in nature, the quadrennial report, it would appear, is currently approached in such a way as to limit any waste of time and energy, the result being the involvement of the bare minimum of persons. Also, the rhythm of reporting is a factor, for once the task is classified as largely bureaucratic, it is easily forgotten until the next deadline looms large. In response to a question about what it would take to transform the convention into a vital presence in Danish cultural life, Anders Kronborg, previous chairman of the board of the DFI, highlights the issue of frequency. And he says, you could argue that if you were to report more frequently, that would create more focus. The frequency is quite simply too infrequent. After all, we're not talking about the Olympics here, end of quote. The DFI's main purpose, as agreed with government, is, quote, to promote film art, film culture, and cinema culture in Denmark. Core tasks involving funding the production and development of films and their promotion and dissemination, preserving and providing access to the national film heritage, and providing classifications and advice on films and moving images, end of quote. Referring to the DFI's funding and mission, Palle Damlegård at the DFI describes the convention as being of secondary importance. He says, our resources are limited, including our cognitive ones. Our primary role is to focus on our core areas. We are not charged with doing politics or with the development of initiatives that go beyond what we're given a remit for, and indeed funding for, end of quote. At the same time, Damlegård is quick to point out that the DFI in no way opposes the convention and in fact operates quite naturally in accordance with its priorities and goals. He says, so much of what we are doing these days is fully in accordance with the convention, even if we don't talk about it, end of quote. Damlegård evokes the DFI's diversity efforts focusing on regionality, ethnicity and gender, the DFI's co-production agreements, and the programming of the DFI's Cinematheque. There is, following Damlegård, a wealth of DFI initiatives that could, quote, easily be hung on the UNESCO hook, end of quote. Given, however, that the convention has not in fact prompted the initiatives in question, there is no compelling reason to report fully on every undertaking that happens to be consistent with the convention's aspirations. As Damlegård sees it, the convention provides an unproblematic framework, making it unnecessary for DFI employees to engage with the details of its texts, articles, or reports. He likens the convention to the EU's Audiovisual Media Services Directive, the AVMSD, an instrument that coordinates national legislation regarding all audiovisual media across the EU. The AVMSD, claims Damlegård, is decisive for the operations of the DFI, yet it would be unreasonable to expect all DFI employees to be intimately informed about its intricacies. Next slide. He says, the AVMSD is an EU directive that regulates our way of running our operations, that is, rules about competition and such. It is bureaucratic, but nonetheless crucial for our way of operating as a film institute. But this is not something our employees know anything about because they don't need to know anything about it. I think this is also true in the case of the UNESCO Convention. AVMSD is important and it's part of our framework, but that's not the same as saying that people at the DFI know a lot about it. Among other things, the AVMSD requires us to respect cultural and linguistic diversity in keeping with the UNESCO Convention. End of quote. Damlegård's references to the AVMSD and the Convention make it clear that cultural diversity is actually prescribed by two policy documents, each of them constitutive of the very field in which players operate, albeit in ways that are mostly opaque. Individuals with responsibility for core activities in the areas of programming for the Cinematheque and digitalization, areas that have been the subject of DFI reporting, do indeed claim to be unaware of the DFI's involvement via the Ministry of Culture and the AVMSD with the workings of the Convention. In the case of diversity, the person driving the DFI's efforts related to ethnicity and gender admits to having only recently become aware of the DFI's periodic reports and of how the convention is meant to become a living reality through the efforts of CSOs/PSOs such as the DFI. It is clear then that the convention cannot be said to provide the impetus for the various initiatives that the DFI submits to the UNESCO Secretariat, and this is in fact reflected in the reports, where a negative response to the question, next slide, Was this measure introduced or revised in order to implement the provisions of the Convention? A negative response is systematically recorded. There is, however, one area of DFI's operations that appears to have been strategically informed by the Convention, and this is the DFI's Centre for Children and Youth Film. Charlotte Giese, head of the Cinema, Culture and Education Centre for Children and Youth Film from 1998 to 2015, speaks of the Convention as follows with reference to her inputs to the DFI's periodic reports. Quote, "Most importantly, inasmuch as Denmark has signed the Convention and files reports with reference to it, we do have certain responsibilities. That said, there are no specified targets." End of quote. That the Convention is well known to Giese is no accident, given her passion for developing film talent on a transnational basis spanning the Global South, Global North, in partnership, for example, with Ugandan, Tanzanian, and Palestinian filmmakers. Giese's projects have often involved the Danish Centre for Culture and Development, the DCCD, the very organisation that was the central pillar in Denmark's engagement with the developing world, and through this, with the Convention. Next slide. Indeed, the responsibilities evoked by Giese relate to Articles 14, 15, and 16 of the Convention, among others. Entitled Cooperation for Development, Article 14 commits signatories to efforts aimed at supporting cooperation for sustainable development and poverty reduction, especially in relation to the specific needs of developing countries. Actions envisaged include, quote, "the strengthening of the cultural industries in the developing countries, capacity building through the exchange of information, experience, and expertise, as well as the training of human resources in developing countries," end quote. Article 15 encourages signatories to cooperate with developing countries through collaborative agreements. Finally, Article 16 envisages, quote, "preferential treatment for developing countries," end of quote. Developed countries, that is, are to, quote, "facilitate cultural exchanges with developing countries by granting preferential treatment to artists and other cultural professionals and practitioners, as well as cultural goods and services from developing countries," end of quote, and that's UNESCO's basic text. For Danish cultural practitioners with a strong interest in nurturing cultural links and exchanges with the developing world, the Convention was once an important policy resource with the potential to lend credibility, legitimacy, and urgency to certain undertakings. As our discussion of key phenomena below shows, this is no longer the case. The demise of the DCCD, itself the result of changing political winds, being an important factor. As we turn now to Denmark's reports from 2012, 2016, and 2020, we note that the developing world, the Global South, becomes less central over the years, to the point of being entirely absent from film-related reporting in 2020. So I turn now to Denmark's quadrennial reports, and I look at foci and tendencies. The periodic report filed in 2012 by the Deputy Permanent Secretary for the Ministry of Culture is a comprehensive document that looks inward to cultural activities and priorities within the nation-state of Denmark, but also outward, the latter dimension being clearly informed by Articles 14, 15, and 16, which we just considered. Indeed, the outward-looking aspect is prevalent, for the report features, quote, "a special focus on international cooperation and cultural exchange and the integration of culture in sustainable development policies," end of quote, from the report. To exemplify cultural policies and measures in this area, the report offers an account of Danish film policy and the activities of the DCCD, the latter being described as, quote, "the key actor regarding cultural exchange with developing countries," end of quote. Next slide, please. The DCCD's activities serve to bring the cultures of developing countries to Denmark, to contribute to intercultural understanding, and to create opportunities for cultural practitioners from the developing world, as well as in Denmark. It was also charged with capacity building and the development of adequate platforms for culture in the developing world. Consistent with the report's special focus on international cooperation and cultural exchange and the integration of culture in sustainable development policies, the 2012 report to UNESCO features no fewer than 6 examples of the DCCD's projects in the developing world. A section of the 2012 report is devoted to the preferential treatment of developing countries as envisaged by the Convention, and here the key point is to highlight the DFI's collaborations with the DCCD through the Department for Children and Youth on various film literacy projects on the African continent. Next slide, please. Filed again by the Deputy Permanent Secretary at the Danish Ministry of Culture, the 2016 report offers a preamble that is more inward-looking than that of 2012. Whereas priority was given in the 2012 report to international cooperation and sustainable development policies, the 2016 report asserts that Danish cultural policy places, quote, special emphasis on efforts with regards to minorities, end quote. The salience of multicultural Denmark in popular Danish imaginaries is evident in the further claim that, quote, work is ongoing with associations of general education, sports associations, at libraries and many other cultural institutions to ensure that there are platforms for intercultural meetings between the different cultures that exist at all levels of the Danish society, end of quote. The emphasis on interculturalism suggests that the point is not so much to ensure that certain groups have, quote, access to their own cultural expressions, quoting from the UNESCO Basic Text, Article 7, but rather the point is to foster shared understandings and the adoption of a common culture. Strikingly, the growing multiculturalism of Danish society provides the context for some of the challenges that are evoked in the report's concluding section devoted to achievements and challenges. Calling attention to the need for cultural awareness and social cohesion across Denmark, the 2016 report identifies an envisaged cultural policy initiative that would construct an explicit canon. Based on input from the, quote, entire population, this canon would, quote, capture the values, traditions, and habits that constitute a part of a common Danish narrative, end of quote. Highly controversial at the time of its implementation, the canon initiative is essentially about the commonalities of a shared national culture, not cultural diversity. Then Minister of Culture Bertel Haarder, a member of Denmark's Liberal Party, saw his proposed intervention as a much-needed attempt to strengthen enduring Danish values, ones preceding the highly visible multicultural transformations of Denmark's recent past. The necessity in question, he claimed, was traceable to growing ethnic and cultural diversity, some of it a matter of conflict and threat. Next slide, please. He says, there are those who have contempt for us and our values, but we should not be cowed by this, especially the fact that so many citizens are joining us from foreign cultural backgrounds is an argument for far greater cultural clarity on our part, end of quote. Next slide, please. By 2016, then, reporting in connection with the convention had become a matter of highlighting cultural diversity traceable to minorities and newcomers as a problem and as a challenge. Next slide, please. Tensions between explicitly articulated political priorities and tendencies in Denmark in 2016, on the one hand, and the convention on the other, are also apparent in another of the report's identified challenges, namely the closure of the Danish Centre for Culture and Development by the end of 2016. The report rightly admits that, quote, new ways of incorporating culture in order to achieve overall development priorities, end of quote, would be needed in the wake of the government's decision to close the DCCD and discontinue its many programs. According to Rytov, the necessary commitment to development priorities as they relate to culture has yet to materialize. Indeed, so great was Rytov's concern about precisely this matter that he contacted the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 2021 in order to draw attention to the ways in which Denmark, as a signatory of the convention, was failing to honour its duties towards the developing world. Noting that Danish public diplomacy is now largely concerned with the strategic, quote, presentation of Danish culture and values, end of quote, on a global stage, Rytov argues that the closure of the DCD was highly significant. Essentially, Denmark, having previously been what he calls a serious partner in the context of international cultural cooperation, became what he calls an unreliable partner, a country without a coordinated strategy in the relevant area. Reithoff's concerns sparked a query from Uffe Elbæk, an independent member of the Danish Parliament, to the Minister for Development Cooperation on the 30th of June 2021. Elbæk wished to know how current Danish approaches could be construed as meeting Denmark's obligations towards developing countries as specified in Articles 12, 14 and 16 of the Convention. Møller Mortensen's response to Elbæk, and thus also to Reithoff, was to defend the government's new development strategy called The World We Share, which does not in fact earmark any funds at all for cultural projects as a means of furthering the work of development. In Denmark's 2016 report to UNESCO, the DFI's activities account for 3 separate entries. New slide. The Cinema in Schools project, which seeks to enhance the film literacy of children and young people. The Cinematheque's programming of films from Bhutan, Mongolia, Taiwan, Slovakia, Armenia, Georgia, Cuba, and Iran, with the intent of broadening the cultural horizons of Danish audiences. And the creation of an international office encompassing cross-border training programs. Described as initiatives of the DFI's international office, Cinema on the Road Lebanon and Film Lab Palestine offer examples of how the DFI supports media literacy and talent development internationally. Involving collaboration among the Danish Embassy in Lebanon, the Metropolis Art Cinema in Beirut, and the DFI, Cinema on the Road offered screenings in schools and refugee camps in Lebanon. In the case of Film Lab Palestine, a talent development and capacity building initiative, the partners listed are the DCCD, Aarhus Film Workshop, and the DFI. In each case, the report indicates that the motivation for the DFI initiative in question was something other than the goal of implementing the convention. Next slide. The 2020 report filed by Nikki Valbjørn-Trebien from the Danish Ministry of Culture captures 2 DFI contributions, both related to gender, the first being in fact a precursor to the second. The so-called Initiative of Better Gender Balance within Danish Film, reported under Goal 4 of the Convention, which concerns the promotion of human rights and fundamental freedoms as this relates to gender equality. Reference is made to the establishing in 2016 of a working group charged with offering recommendations about how best to achieve gender equity, and to a forum in 2017 that led to a commitment to monitor gender-related data on an annual basis. The related Declaration on Gender Distribution is also described under Goal 4, the emphasis being on how the DFI partnered with the Danish Producers Association and Danish film directors in 2020 to ensure that gender is a well-considered factor in funding decisions and in producers' thinking. The initiative requires producers seeking support for fiction, documentary, games, digital game production, and the talent scheme New Danish Screen to provide information on the gender distribution of production and to update their data when filing their final accounts with the DFI. Next slide, please. When queried about the absence of initiatives related to the developing world in the 2020 report, Palle Damlegaard points to what he sees as, quote, changing paradigms, end quote, within the context of Danish national imaginaries. He says, we may well have been more interested in Ramallah and in Palestinians and their problems a decade ago. And today we're more interested in gender diversity and our own demographics and ethnicity, and in the challenges we have along internal lines. So there's a shift in direction, and I think that's quite natural, end of quote. Anticipating what the DFI is likely to report in the next quadrennial report due in 2024, Damlegaard draws attention to Greenland and the Faroe Islands, sovereign territories within the realm of Denmark. He refers to Nordoc, a 29 initiative administered by the DFI for the purposes of nurturing documentary film production in Greenland and on the Faroe Islands. Building on Nordoc, the DFI has now earmarked around 27 million Danish crowns, about 2.7 million pounds, for a diversity initiative that takes the Danish realm as its basic framework. The goal more specifically is to develop indigenous film talents in an entire film production ecology so as to ensure the telling of properly Greenlandic and Faroese stories. Once again, however, the prompt, Damlegor emphatically insists, is not the convention, but rather the dynamics of Danish imaginaries, history, and political priorities. Next slide, please. Having canvassed key tendencies in the 2012, 2016, and 20 reports, let us turn now to three specific developments that clearly suggest that Denmark is distancing itself from its obligations as a signatory of the UNESCO Convention. The demise of the Danish Centre for Culture and Development is my next section. In Denmark's quadrennial reports from 2012 and 2016, an account is given of the DCCD's activities that is indicative of the PSO's strategic engagement with the Convention. Next slide. Next slide, please. During its existence from 1998 to 2016, the DCCD ran cultural programs in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East in collaboration with Danish embassies and local partners in the countries in question. Some of these programs had an explicit focus on film, and from 2013 onwards, they were governed by the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs Strategy for Culture and Development, as articulated in two convention-consistent Parliament-endorsed policy documents. Aimed at poverty reduction and the promotion of human rights, the Right to a Better Life was adopted by the Danish Parliament in June 2012. Adopted in May 2013, the Right to Art and Culture was designed to promote positive change through art and culture through the pursuit of 5 strategic priorities. Next slide, please. Empowering people through active participation in art and cultural activities, ensuring freedom of expression for artists and cultural actors, enhancing economic growth through creative industries, strengthening peace and reconciliation in post-conflict areas through art and cultural activities, and promoting intercultural dialogue and intercultural collaboration. And that is from the policy document, The Right to Art and Culture. 2 examples of the DCCD's engagement with film in East Africa offer insight into the organization's deployment of film as a tool for development. Next slide, please. A collaboration between the DCCD, the DFI, and Mira Nair's Kampala-based Maisha Film Lab, Youth and Film Uganda Youth Cultures Project, funded in 2 phases from 2010 to 2016, was spearheaded by the DFI Centre for Children and Youth Film under Charlotte Giese, in partnership with Vibeke Munch-Petersen of the DCCD. Aimed at children and young people aged 13 to 19, the program reflected the vision of Maisha as a, quote, leadership development organization that aims not only to make films, but to make filmmakers, end of quote, and that's Maisha. Encompassing film clubs for youth, film festivals, film labs, master classes, and participation in the Copenhagen-based CPH DOCS Film Festival's Transnational Training Lab, DOCS Lab, the Ugandan program gave priority to, quote, social cohesion and economic empowerment, and I'm quoting from Maisha. For example, the program was implemented in towns such as Gulu, right up in the northern part of Uganda, where social cohesion had been severely undermined by atrocities committed by Joseph Kony's Lord's Resistance Army. The last film-related program to be mounted in Africa by the DCCD was the Kenya Culture and Development Program, funded from 2014 to 2017 and persisting 1 year beyond the official closing of the DCCD in 2016. Next slide, please. In the case of Kenya, priorities 1, empowering people, and 3, enhancing economic growth of the Right to Art and Culture policy was selected by Kenyan lawyer and DCCD program manager Elizabeth Miner, who is here in the picture, following a needs-based assessment of local partners' activities. Reflecting on the rationale for the design of the program, Miner points out that a conscious decision was made not to focus on peace and reconciliation and intercultural dialogue in the case of Kenya, because a large number of international organizations were already active in the relevant area. Next slide, please. The DCCD's partner for the film-related activities of the programme was Kenyan filmmaker Judy Kibinga and her documentary Film Fund. And Lindiwe Dovi at SOAS has just made a wonderful documentary about the work of Judy Kibinga, which I really recommend. With funding from the Ford Foundation already in place for DocuBox's production of Africa-centric documentaries, the DCCD opted to support the Film Fund's goals of audience building and assisting African filmmakers with the distribution of their films. The DCCD thus offered funding for film screenings in 6 counties outside of the capital of Nairobi, in Nakuru and Machakos, for example. According to Mina, the DCCD's aim was to grow interest in documentary filmmaking so that DocuBox would get a robust response from all over the country to its calls for submissions for production support. According to critics of Lars Løkke Rasmussen's government, the decision to close the DCCD in 2016 marked a dramatic weakening of Denmark's commitment to UNESCO's convention. Writing in response to the government's intention entirely to eliminate or seriously to sideline art and culture from its development work, the DCCD board issued a joint statement highlighting the cultural organization's significance in the context of Denmark's obligations as a signatory of the convention. Quote, ever since then Minister of Culture Brian Mikkelsen signed the convention on behalf of Denmark in 2006, the DCCD has ensured that Denmark meets its obligations, end of quote. And that's Bjørn, Talea and Holm speaking in 2015. Interestingly, Denmark's 2016 report to UNESCO draws an attention to an evaluation of the DCCD following its closure. This assessment is said to have shown that, quote, DCCD-funded activities have had a transformative impact at the individual as well as at community levels, end of quote, and that they have, quote, succeeded in strengthening the voice and creative expressions of marginalized groups, end of quote. Attention is also drawn to the DCCD's strategy for culture and development as a model for how culture can be integrated in sustainable development frameworks, Goal 3 of the Convention, and used to implement sustainable development goals. Left unanswered in the submission are obvious questions readers might have regarding both the reasons for dismantling such a successful organization and the ramifications for Denmark's seriousness as a signatory of the Convention. These questions remain pertinent today and have, as Write-Off's attempt to engage the government in 2021 shows, yet to be answered in a satisfactory manner. We move to the next slide, please, and to the section on Film Lab Palestine and Film Lab Zanzibar. As noted above, Denmark's 2016 report to UNESCO highlights Film Lab Palestine under the activities of the International Office of the Danish Film Institute as an example of efforts in the area of international film exchange. The DFI is identified as the agency responsible for the implementation of the measure, in collaboration with partners such as the now defunct DCCD and the Aarhus Film Workshop, the latter being funded by the DFI. Young people are at the heart of the collaborative efforts, a priority that is consistent with Denmark's earmarking of 25% of public funding for children and youth films, and with the DFI's commitment through its Centre for Children and Youth Film to creating the conditions under which the cultural rights of children and young people can be met. These conditions include the production of a rich variety of age-appropriate films, as well as the provision of opportunities for children to engage practically with the art and craft of filmmaking. Evoking Denmark's support for Film Lab Palestine, the 2016 report to the UNESCO Secretariat captures the goals being pursued through the DFI's involvement in international film exchange. Next slide, please. Film Lab Palestine is a non-profit organization with its base in Ramallah. The Film Lab focuses on empowering young people in refugee camps and settlements, in schools and communities, as well as the early talents of the local professional film industry. The objective is to strengthen local cinema culture, media literacy, and talent development. It involves building strategic, creative, and production capacities, as well as training of trainers among NGOs, institutions, and schools. And that's from the 2016 report. Charlotte Giese has been the key figure driving the DFI's involvement with Film Lab Palestine since its establishing by filmmaker Hannah Atalla in Ramallah, Palestine in 2014. In addition to her fundraising efforts, Giese has been effective in mobilizing relevant talent in Denmark and in creating a solidarity-based network of Danish practitioners who see the merit, both for Denmark and Palestine, of transnational talent development. Next slide. Thus, for example, Giese launched an iPad-based film production initiative at Film Lab Palestine with the help of Kasper B. Olsen, founder-director of the company Pocket Film. She secured the support of Pami Larsen, head of the DFI's Copenhagen-based film workshop, for talent development activities in Ramallah. In 2017, producer Johnny Andersen, then director of the DFI's talent development scheme, New Danish Screen, was recruited by Giese for workshops in Ramallah. Finally, having garnered support from the Danish NGO International Media Support, from the DFI and from the Danish House in Ramallah, Giese commissioned a report on organizations, projects and strategies related to children and young people's film and media literacy in Palestine, the point being to produce a document that would assist Film Lab Palestine with further fundraising. I was the author of the report together with Khulud Badawi, and we presented the report to the Ministry of Education and Higher Education and to the Ministry of Culture in Ramallah in 2017. Now, having served as the founding head of the Center for Children and Youth Film at the DFI until 2015, Giese assumed a new role as special advisor to the DFI in 2015, a professional shift that is telling in the present context of an assessment of the status of the UNESCO Convention in the Danish landscape of film and film culture. Acutely aware of the Danish government's decision to roll back its cultural engagement with the developing world and of the ramifications of new political priorities, Giese has in recent years committed more of her time to freelance work, for example, in the capacity of consultant. From January 2019 to the present, she has served as the strategic consultant for Film Lab Palestine's Next Generation program. Next slide. In January 2019, Giese also assumed the role of strategic consultant for Film Lab Zanzibar, a lab that is under development and very much inspired by Atalla's project in Ramallah. Giese's involvement with Film Lab Zanzibar builds on her long-standing collaboration with the Tanzanian filmmaker and retired academic Martin Mando, and with the Tanzanian scriptwriter Farida Nyamachumbe. More specifically, having been contacted by Mando in his capacity as film director of the Zanzibar International Film Festival, Giese helped to launch a children and film panorama at ZIF in 2008, the aim being, quote, to give children access to a diversity of films in terms of genre, content, and cultural origin, to inspire the professional filmmakers in the creation of films for children, and to promote debate about a policy for film production, film distribution, and film education for children. And I'm quoting myself here from 2015. Although this is not reflected in Denmark's official reporting to UNESCO, Giese, a close collaborator of the convention-friendly Henning Kammerer during his years as CEO of the DFI, has been explicit about her commitment through the Center for Children and Youth Film to furthering the convention's goal of enabling especially developing countries to strengthen their means of cultural expression. In 2014, the year when Film Lab Palestine was established, it was still possible to find Danish funding for solidarity-based international cooperation with film-related organizations in the developing world. The situation, just under a decade later, is greatly changed, and it is no accident then that the boost needed to make Film Lab Zanzibar a reality has come not from Denmark, Giese's best efforts notwithstanding, but from Germany through the DW Akademie Film Development Fund. Next slide, please. Whereas the history of Film Lab Palestine involves a rich web of Danish connections and contributions based on solidarity principles, Film Lab Zanzibar has failed to date to secure a similar level of support from Denmark. The difference here is traceable to Denmark's significantly diminished interest in engaging culturally with the developing world, that is, to the country's growing indifference, I would argue, to the convention as a vitally important instrument of international cultural policy. My final section, next slide please. The Danish film industry's Charter of Diversity, the policy effects of a tone-deaf rejection letter. In 2016, the Danish Film Institute submitted the Charter of Diversity to the Danish Ministry of Culture as an example of activities to draw attention to the convention's purpose and existence. A mere 6 lines of text, the DFI's description of the Charter identifies the relevant diversity initiative as a collaborative agreement involving the DFI and the Danish film industry. A connection between diversity on the one hand and the quality of cinematic expressions in Denmark on the other is established. The aim of the Charter being to pursue, quote, the development of Danish film and to heighten the quality of Danish film by nurturing a variety of expressions and by including all Danes regardless of ancestry, both in front of and behind the camera, end of quote. Committed to ethnic diversity and the inclusion of Danes with immigrant and refugee backgrounds, the Charter of Diversity was the first pillar in the DFI's diversity platform, the latter having since been expanded to include gender and regional differences in Denmark. It is important to note that although the Charter of Diversity marks a significant convention-consistent development and was submitted to the Danish Ministry of Culture as such, it was not in fact included in the quadrennial report that Denmark filed with UNESCO. Omissions such as this are significant, for they weaken the motivation on the part of CSOs/PSOs to engage with the convention. Also, they undermine the overall picture of the convention's process of implementation, given that signatories' quadrennial reports on the UNESCO'S site have the appearance of being comprehensive. Next slide. The Charter of Diversity is a good example of a convention-consistent, change-oriented measure being implemented for reasons that have absolutely nothing to do with UNESCO. The origins of the Charter of Diversity are to be found in a controversial funding decision. More specifically, in 2012, the Danish Film Institute rejected a funding request for MGP Missionen, in English, the contest to the stars and back. Next slide, please. The stated rationale for the rejection being, quote, that actors with other ethnic backgrounds are not bankable in the provinces of Denmark, end of quote. A youth film, the contest recounts the story of a 12-year-old Carl Højby Hansen who experiences issues of adjustment when his mother moves him from rural Denmark to the Nørrebro area of Copenhagen and to a school where 80% of the pupils have mother tongues other than Danish. Carl's plans to return to the San in Jutland, where his grandparents still live, take an unexpected turn when he develops a robust friendship with the Turkish pupil Sausan, played by Malika Sia Graf, who dreams of participating in the final of the Melodie Grand Prix, her parents' objections notwithstanding. The film found alternative funding sources and ended up being nominated for a European Film Award in 2014, bolstering the view that the DFI's funding decision was myopic and prejudicial. What the decision reflected was a failure to understand that quality filmmaking requires compelling stories and that Denmark's increasingly diverse multicultural reality is a significant resource in this regard. The controversy surrounding the contest prompted the DFI to undertake research on the extent to which Danes of immigrant and refugee backgrounds participate in the Danish film industry, be it in front of or behind the camera. An initial report released in 2015 and a subsequent report released in 2018 make it clear that the ethnic composition of the Danish film industry falls short of reflecting the ethnic diversity of the country. What is more, inasmuch as so-called new Danes actually are visible on the screen, their presence tends to take the form of supporting characters. Equally problematic is the fact that the supporting characters played by so-called new Danes typically have very specific identities. As Claus Ledegaard, now CEO of the DFI, put it in 2015, quote, the problem is that most new Danes play roles such as pizza deliverers, greengrocers, and criminals, end of quote. The Charter of Diversity was an attempt to mitigate problems of both under and over representation and to do this, among other things, through a broad-based commitment across the Danish film industry to the creation of a mentorship scheme and a database with the film-related professional profiles of new Danes. The controversy sparked by the film The Contest occurred at a time when the growing influence of the anti-immigrant Danish People's Party was increasingly polarizing Danish society into pro-immigrant and anti-immigrant camps. Indeed, when the Charter of Diversity was adopted, Alex Arendsson, representing the anti-immigrant Danish People's Party, voiced a number of objections to it, one of which was that the initiative would undoubtedly lead to the introduction of pro-immigrant quotas. This ideological landscape informed DFI CEO Hjort's statements in 2015, a key contention of his being that the Charter is an attempt to heighten the quality of Danish film by drawing on untapped talent and should not be confused with a politically oriented integration project, to use his words. Next slide, please. The point is that the convention-consistent policy measure was introduced as a result of internal dynamics in the Danish nation-state and not with reference to Denmark's obligations as a signatory of an international agreement. Driving the dynamics in question are factors such as the changing ethnic composition of the Danish population and a public sphere characterized by polarized debates about multiculturalism. In this context, a poorly worded rejection letter written on behalf of a public sector organization charged with dispersing public funds earmarked for film became the spark that produced convention-consistent efforts to effect change. My conclusion. Drawing on assumptions about Denmark as a small nation with a proud heritage of cultural policy development and progressive cultural thinking. Next slide, please. The Danish Ministry of Culture has repeatedly assumed that Denmark quite naturally is furthering the goals of the 2005 UNESCO Convention for the Protection and Promotion of the Diversity of Cultural Expressions. However, an examination of CSO, PSO activities related to film over approximately a 10-year period suggests that Denmark's strategic engagement with the convention has declined substantially, due in large measure to a changing political landscape. Marked by hostility towards migrants and refugees, a weakened commitment to culture as a source of public value, and a profound lack of interest in culture as a tool for development, the Danish political landscape is now largely inhospitable to the convention's goals regarding the developing world. In the wake of the demise of the DCCD, film-related engagement with the convention rests largely on the shoulders of the DFI, a public sector organization that charts its course not with reference to UNESCO, but in response to its core government-mandated mission and, above all, the needs of the Danish film industry. If the 2005 UNESCO Convention for the Protection and Promotion of the Diversity of Cultural Expressions is to be a living instrument of international cultural policy, the engagement of signatories must be authentic and consistent. The Danish government's decisions, first, to close the DCCD in 2016, and second, to exclude culture from its strategic support for the developing world in 2021, make it hard to deploy adjectives such as authentic and consistent with reference to Denmark's position as a signatory of the convention. Next slide. If the very being of international policy formations depends on the nature of the actions being taken at national and subnational levels, then it is fair to conclude, I think, that Denmark's actions are sapping the UNESCO Convention of much needed vitality. And I'll stop there. Thank you for listening. Hongwei, can you hear me? I'm not sure whether Hongwei is still there.
I think he's freezing.
I think he might be frozen.
He's freezing.
Hello, hi, sorry about that.
No worries, no
Yeah.
worries. I think you're still frozen.
Yes, yeah, technical glitch. So can you hear me now?
Absolutely.
Okay, brilliant. So thank you, Matt, for the wonderful talk. Although your talk, addresses, the situation or the case study of Denmark in particular, but I find that it is also relevant to other countries. When talking about the British context, we can say similar things about, for example, Arts Council, England, or British Film Institute, and so on. But of course, each case has different specificities. So I've really learned a lot. Thanks very much. So now let's open up the floor for discussions. So do we have any questions? If you have any questions, feel free just to, well, either to type the questions in the chat or to open your mic and camera and ask questions. So
maybe while people are gathering their thoughts, I could just respond to what you've just said, Hongwei. That was absolutely the intention behind this paper. It really zeroes in on one particular context where I sort of had access to the information needed to do a fairly close analysis, but my assumption throughout was that a lot of the different points would probably be relevant in other contexts as well. That was the hope, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. For example, if you talk to some charities or some not-for-profit organizations in the UK, and they probably can share you the similar stories, actually. So there is a very inward-looking turn of the UK cultural policy. So essentially, the previous many international projects have been cut down or discouraged, and in favor of, for example, more local and more national projects. And of course, there's nothing wrong with that. The only issue is that to what extent has the cultural organizations promoted or does its best to promote cultural diversity and cultural differences. So those are issues. So about a few years ago, probably 10 years ago, so BBC World Service, which is an excellent news service, was closed down. So that was really a big loss for really the cultural diversity in many parts of the world. And British Council, as well as other organizations, are also constantly facing this financial cut. So it couldn't carry out many projects as it wanted to. So that's really a kind of shared issue. Exactly. So I'm also thinking about this kind of global trend of fund cutting under neoliberalism, as well as kind of increasing rise of nationalism and parochialism. So in the past, globalization is seen as a good thing. It's great to have a cosmopolitan mindset, but now actually, especially since the pandemic, actually, many countries have changed their cultural policy. Could you also talk about the recent changes? Has, for example, the COVID impacted upon the Danish Film Institute's practices?
Right. Whether it's impacted with regard to engagement with a wider world or sort of more, I don't think so. The whole response, I've written about this, the whole response to COVID in Denmark was this was for a special issue of cultural studies that John Ernie and a collaborator put together, and it since has come out as a book, where I looked at the response to COVID in Denmark. And what was striking was the extent to which it revealed extraordinarily parochial attitudes. It was really, really quite remarkable. So I would say that what sort of watching all of this unfold from the context of Hong Kong right next to China and so on and so forth, it was really remarkable to see how inward looking the entire process was of responding to COVID, and how uninterested the authorities and population were in looking to best practices that were basically emerging in other parts of the world, more specifically in Asia and so on. So that kind of, you know, inward turn was certainly part of the COVID response. To what extent it's actually sort of impacted on the cultural sector in terms of engaging a wider world, I don't think I see anything specifically there. It happens to be the case that the economics of Denmark right now are really, really good. The economic predictions have been by far surpassed. So there's a kind of enormous optimism around this booming economy, and one can hope that maybe that will sort of like translate into further support for culture in the first instance, and then for cultural collaboration and so on. But you know, in response to what you said before, I mean, I see culture being squeezed more and more and more, and then I see cultural collaboration also being squeezed, right? So it's this kind of double way of squeezing things that we actually support and care about. And of course, that's certainly something that we're seeing in the UK context as well, you know, the squeezing of culture. Yeah. Mm.
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks for sharing your ideas and thoughts. So do we have any questions? I can always ask more questions, but I'll leave the opportunity to the audience.
Can I have one?
Yeah, sure. Please go ahead.
I'm wondering if you think this is like, it marks the beginning of an decrease or perhaps a collapse of internationalization, like because UNESCO and the UN in general has been considered as like at the forefront of internationalization of the last and this century. And would you talk a bit about like the implications of that for organizations like UNESCO or even the UN in general?
Right. Well, I mean, it does seem to me that we're sort of in a historical moment where the legitimacy of a lot of those sorts of organizations is no longer robustly taken for granted. And, you know, if you look at what is happening in terms of, you know, human rights, which once enjoyed a certain kind of solid standing, and the extent to which suddenly, you know, they are seen as legitimate targets and so on and so forth. I mean, I do think that we're in a period where there is a kind of very much a reorganization and remaking of the world, and you know, where internationalism, internationalization, globalization, etc., all of these are no longer seen as goods, and of course they were always amenable to multiple forms of definition and multiple practices and so on. But there's a lot. It seems there's a lot less space for you know, constructive and positive forms of you know, internationalization, globalization, and so on. So yeah, I mean, I think one thing that interests me a lot is, you know, solidarity-based connections, and you know, I've been quite interested in gift culture, and of course you can only take it so far, but it's not completely without impact, and so, you know, if I look at the kind of network that emerged around Film Lab Palestine, that was really quite interesting, because the amount of funding that was available for support in the Danish Film Institute context was actually quite limited. But what Tala in Ramallah and Gisa in Copenhagen were able to do was sort of bring together a group of like-minded people who each from their own particular site were able to sort of bring something to the collaboration. And there was this this great sense of a kind of a partnership of equals. There was a great sense of everybody sort of pulling together because they saw the shared and common value from different angles and perspectives of doing something together. And so I think that those sorts of things are incredibly valuable. And in terms of our sort of agency as academics and intellectuals and so on and so forth, that is a sphere where we can continue to do really meaningful and good work. So, you know, this idea of solidarity-based networks, friendship-driven networks, where you do things on a shoestring, but end up actually doing quite remarkable things because the people around the table or the people in the room are quite, you know, astonishingly talented and accomplished people. So I think we need to sort of look to those kinds of spaces and models increasingly, and then hope for better times, you know. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
You're very optimistic, so thank you, Matt. I also think university is a great space for possibility. So we all come from different parts of the world. Our students come from different world. Despite the so many constraints, university is still a place that value cultural differences and cultural exchange.
Exactly. Yeah. And there are many, I mean, you know, in terms of sort of online initiatives and so on and so forth, there are of course so many different ways in which we can also, you know, collaborate and so on, and also actually get, you know, the students involved. So, you know, I'll be going to Zanzibar towards the end of June, and one of the things I hope to do is to get our students involved in the pre-jury work of the Zanzibar International Film Festival, which is something that students at Hong Kong Baptist University were involved with, and it was just wonderful. And these again are sorts of, you know, forms of collaboration that bring benefit to so many different places and people at different stages of their lives and so on. So yeah, I think we must never underestimate the humble and the modest. Yeah.
Absolutely. Do we have questions from the audience? I know that we only have 3 audiences, but while you were talking, I received a couple of emails from colleagues who were saying that they couldn't find the Teams link, etc. So
no worries. I was just thinking actually, Hongwei, that it's probably best not to sort of share.
That's fine. That's perfectly fine.
Because the piece is forthcoming in a policy book that John Hill and Paul MacDonald and Ruby Chung are putting together, and I'm not quite sure when it's coming out, so I wouldn't want them to be surprised by suddenly finding talk online.
That's perfectly fine. There's always this dilemma of not wanting to publish before it's officially published. I completely respect that. That's perfectly fine.
Yeah.
So yeah, well, Long Long and Yang Dong, if you have any questions, you are thinking about questions, can I ask another question, which is the kind of conflation of ideas actually between the nation, the state, and ethnicity. For example, in the UNESCO Convention, one thing is that is mentioned, which is the kind of sovereign state, the emphasis on sovereign state in deciding its cultural policies. But of course, when sovereignty state decides on its cultural policies, it also decides what is national identity, what is British or Danish national identity. Absolutely. And it can be defined in a very narrow and restricted way as well. And of course, this is also complicated by different racial and ethnic groups, for example. So you are talking about the migrant population in Denmark and so on. So Yeah, I have mixed feelings about this kind of giving all the sovereign control to the state, especially to the nation state, in promoting its cultural diversity.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And I mean, it seems like so much of the thinking is really quite unreflective. So one thing that I noticed was that in I think it was the 2012 report, mention was made of the German minority in the southern part of Denmark and how important it was to give the German minority access to German culture and so on and so forth, right? And then by the time we get to the 2016 report, suddenly people of other ethnicity have become a problem who have to sort of be brought into a shared common culture, right? So one sees the one sees the contradictions, one sees the prejudices, and so on, and of course it is all a question of which form of nationalism is one actually embracing. Is it an ethnic nationalism? Because that's what we start to see emerging, where there is this kind of primordial, enduring sense of Danishness, which newcomers need to sort of like learn to appreciate and value and not to threaten. Or is it, is it a more sort of, civic nationalism that basically says that, people come from, have different pathways into our society, and basically what binds us together are certain, rights and principles and legal structures, but, the cultural dimension is something that we work out dialogically. So I think that there's a kind of an under theorizing. I guess, the convention, as you look at its different texts and also its implementations, you realize that it's not an especially well theorized entity, and so in order for it perhaps to become a better instrument, or in order for it to be better understood, there needs to be precisely a conversation about, well, what's the relationship between being a signatory and promoting national identity, and what kind of, nationalism underpins the promoting of national identity, and so on and so forth. So these things are all quite under-theorized, and maybe that's the way policy documents are written. I'm not sure, but it just it seems like this one has quite a number of problems. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm aware of the time, so do we have any final questions?
You've been very patient. I read for a long time, so thank you for listening. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. I really enjoyed it. I've learned a lot. So basically, I'm going to keep doing the comparison notes with what's happening in the UK, in China, in USA, etc. So this is really a kind of global issue.
Well, I actually think that you've absolutely put your finger on something, Hongwei, and maybe we should try to talk about that. Try to get people together from different parts of the world to think through this really remarkable shrinkage that is happening, and how one best responds to it, and what is driving it in each case, because some of the drivers will be the same, but others, there's always variation, and so I'd actually be really interested in that. Anyway, something to think about.
Oh, sure. Let's keep up the conversation. So I can see that Long Long and Yang Bang probably they don't have any questions.
That's all right. That's absolutely fine. No worries at all. Listen, let's just thank people for being here. It was really, really nice to have you here.
Yeah, thank you for giving us this wonderful talk. It's nice to have you and everybody here. So this is a great event. So I hope to see you in person at some point.
definitely. I'll be coming to visit you for some coffee before
Yes,
you leave.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And thank you for having me, Hongwei. Really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Okay. Bye.
Bye, everyone. Have a nice
Bye.
afternoon.
Bye, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.